So I recently did a podcast episode where I was talking about health myths. And so I listed off 8 health myths and kind of debunked them, so to speak, or at least from my perspective. And one of them was about saturated fat. I mentioned saturated fat and cholesterol, and that a lot of people think that's what causes heart disease. And so I kind of gave a little bit of a description of like the background behind that and why I don't think that's the main cause of heart disease. And you could argue that it doesn't really contribute to heart disease, but you got to kind of take into account that there's an individual aspect, like each person's a little different and people respond differently to different things and so on and so forth. So there's definitely some layers and some nuance to that I didn't totally get into in that shorter solo podcast episode. But what I wanted to ask you about is when it comes to this saturated fat and fat in general being vilified and being kind of made out to be the boogeyman or the thing that's harming us the most, when from my perspective, I think the thing that's harming us the most is probably sugar, but we can talk about that more later. But just in terms of saturated fat and cholesterol, I'm not an expert on the history, the events that got us here, but I know you've been spending a lot of time looking at it for some of the projects you're working on, including the film, probably. So can you give us kind of a summary of kind of how we got here? How did saturated fat become the villain? And why is it still kind of believed by so many people that saturated fat and cholesterol, and maybe fat in general, are what is going to cause a heart attack?
Yeah, absolutely. The film will really lay it out. And there's been other films in the past that have done this and books out there that have done this. So some people may have heard the story. Well, a lot of it revolves around Ancel Keys. And he's this big figure. And a lot of people think, maybe rightly so, they got this all started. But I guess it started as early as the 1950s with President Eisenhower, who had a heart attack in office. And people were like, what's going on? This new thing is happening around the country, and this didn't happen before. But what also is going on is everyone was smoking. People were smoking. You see that people were smoking. They're smoking in their car. Their baby's in the back seat. The car's full of smoke. They're smoking in the elevator. They're smoking in the office. And then also, we did get all the margarine and all these like fake oils, the PUFAs or the seed oils made into the fake butters and all that stuff. So looking back, I think there was a good reason why people were getting heart attacks. I mean, we know that smoking is very correlated with heart disease and, causal. So that's the real reason. But, we didn't know back then, right? We didn't know what was going on. And there was actually competing ideas. There's a guy, John Yudkin, who was a British guy. And Ancel Keys was saying, hey, what if it's a saturated fat? There's this demonization of animal foods that was going on for even 50 years prior, which is a whole nother story of how we even thought that animal foods were bad, when for all of history, we knew they were good. We still know they're good. Many cultures, I just went to Africa for the film, and everyone's like, of course, everyone there's like, of course, everyone there's trying to get animal foods. That's like the whole goal of every day, is how to acquire animal foods, how to make enough money to purchase animal foods. And if they can't, it's sad, and they have to rely on the fallback foods, some whatever grains or whatever they have available. So for all of history, we understood that animal foods are good. There's this demonization of animal foods. Has to do with Seventh-day Adventists, John Harvey Kellogg. There's a whole story there. But pretty much, Ancel Keys looked at 22 countries. He looked at the saturated fat consumption and their heart disease. And he conveniently left out all the countries that didn't fit his model, his thesis, and he left 7 countries that had this nice little line that went up. As saturated fat went up, heart disease went up. And so he ran with that. And like I said, there's another guy, John Yudkin, had a competing theory. He was in England. What he saw is around the world, when all the British colonies especially, they would kind of come in, they would take over essentially, and they would bring their food, their sacks of flour, sugar, and jugs of oil. And so he said, whenever the sugar and the flour and the oil come in to these populations, that's when the sickness starts. That's when people start getting more overweight. That's when the heart disease starts. I think it's the sugar, flour, oil. And I think this makes sense because we didn't have them throughout history in large amounts at all. and especially the vegetable oils are brand new. And even, you know, sugar is brand new in a sense. Like, yeah, the general population didn't have sugar on hand. It was very valuable, and, you know, and the rich could get it, all that type of stuff. So John Yudkin, very smart, very, very logical, very obvious. Ancel Keys, blaming it on the animal foods. Ancel Keys won. Big personality, very persuasive. Maybe there's more stuff going on there with, you know, big industry and the, you know, what goes on kind of in these politic games, right? This went all the way into the 1980s, really, because that's when the dietary guidelines are really introduced with the food pyramid, with the base of 6 to 11 servings of grain. So really, that this whole time period, it was. There's something called the McGovern Report, and they put together this whole report, and there's lots of stories to it, but the outcome is that a lot of food lobbyists got involved. We had a lot of corn, wheat, and soy that we could grow in the United States. That's when all these subsidies started as well, right? That we could grow them cheaply. And basically that theory that saturated fat was bad won out. And the food pyramid was created, and they said, well, we have to feed the world. Part of the story is even about money, where the first dietary guidelines didn't have all the 6 to 11 servings of grains on the bottom, and it did include more whole foods and animal foods. But then then they realized, oh wait, we have to pay for the food stamps program. We have to pay, you know, the government has to cover the food bill for all these programs. They still do. The military, you know, the nursing homes, the teacher, you know, schools, like all these things, what the government guidelines of food are what has to be done and what is paid for, right? So it's huge implications of the cost. And they kind of just were like, oh, all calories are the same, you know? They didn't have all the science. I'm still trying to combat this notion that all calories are the same. You know, people will still be like, oh, yeah calories in, calories out. Like, that is absolutely false. I mean, we know, especially with protein calories are not like fat or carbs. And now, finally, all the scientific people know this. The actual scientists doing the studies know that to do a proper study these days, you have to equate for protein in the two groups, right? And then you can do the intervention only if you equate for protein. Back then, we didn't know this. We were just like, oh, whatever. So then I guess it makes sense if you don't understand that protein is any different from fat and carbs, and you don't understand that a whole food carb is different from a refined, you know, flour or sugar, then you're just like, oh yeah, why not? Let's just make the food pyramid. All these, the grain lobbying, you know, all these big agricultural lobbyists are giving us a bunch of money and pressure, and all calories are the same. Who cares? This is cheaper. It's cheaper, right? Let's do it. Why not? If all calories are the same, who cares about protein? We'll put protein up at the top. You know, it's crazy looking back on it. And I'm just thinking about it. Like, yeah, it's all because of these big mistakes we made. We didn't have all the science. You could blame some of it on not having all the equipment. Like, we didn't have like the good, even scientific equipment to do these studies back then, right? We finally, like in the 2010s, started equating for protein in our studies, I think it was, right? So I kind of get it, but then I also kind of just see all the big influence behind these decisions and how it drove towards, you know, big food industries making profit. So that's kind of the like top level story, but back to saturated fat specifically and cholesterol. I mean, there's been studies recently that have completely exonerated cholesterol, basically, and saturated fat, and they say it's no longer a nutrient of concern. They're no longer limiting cholesterol but no one knows about it, right? They don't publicize these studies. Like the mainstream media, it goes against all of their narrative and all their best interests, because the big food companies are what are funding the news. So, of course, the news programs aren't going to just be like, have a huge PSA to the world, like, it should have been shouted from the rooftops on every single station, like saturated fat and cholesterol, you know, like they are not linked to heart disease. Like, this is an old idea. Mm-hmm. They did not do that. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a lot. But.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there, and I'm sure that, you know, some of that will be addressed in your film, Food Lies, in more detail and with visual aids and all this fancy stuff. But at the very beginning, you kind of made the point that everybody was smoking, I think that's often forgotten when we're talking about heart disease.
Yep.
And then later you kind of pointed out that sugar, flour, and seed oils, which, by the way, in case anyone listening isn't sure what that's talking about, well, there's like the vegetable oils and the seed oils, which are those really common ones like soybean oil, canola oil, corn oil, I think sunflower and safflower oil. So some of the ones that you'll see on ingredient lists and things like that are highly refined, produced at a high heat, and they have oxidized. Some of those polyunsaturated fatty acids get oxidized. And then there's some other solvents and weird chemicals that are used and then also produced in the process. So kind of combining those in with the flour and the sugar, it's kind of what I call the junk food formula in one of my posts. But so that combined with tobacco, and then maybe a sedentary lifestyle, or some, I think, are probably the main contributors to heart disease. But then there's this whole narrative about saturated fat and cholesterol, and it seems pretty silly. And you made a good point about the dietary guidelines. I think the first ones were in 1980, and then the food pyramid itself was 1992. So the food pyramid, that's when I was growing up. So I remember, learning about that and being like, oh, look, the oils are, and fat in general, but oil, they mentioned oil specifically. I think we're up at the top of the pyramid, just like tiny bit of fat in your diet. So yeah, so there's a lot going on there. I guess it's way more than we can really delve into all the details of in terms of that whole narrative that you explained, but it's a good reason to see that film when it comes out as well. And I know the film Fat Fiction also helped clarify a few of the things that you were touching on there, like the history of Ancel Keys, the 7 countries study. And then there was some other study that was done, but kind of buried, so to speak, in Minnesota.
Minnesota coronary experiment. And yeah, Nita Teicholz helped dig this up, and it was buried for 18 years. And I love their conclusion, because she interviewed the scientists. They found it in someone's basement. And then they went back at the gentleman that did the original study, and they're like, why didn't you publish the results? And he said, well, we were just so disappointed with the results, because it went against what they thought. They went against the paradigm of saturated fat being bad. And it's just so crazy how this stuff happens in science. And it's so crazy how the implications this has in our country and the world, and our health, because of just things like that.
Yeah. It's kind of like confirmation bias. It's like if you want it to be a certain way, and then you ignore everything that goes against that, and you only, pay attention to the things that support it.